Hey. Welcome to the Anti-Bias Educator's first video in the video series on building an anti-bias classroom. This video was designed to help educators like you create anti-bias and anti-racist learning environments where students are seen, heard, and affirmed. My name is Stephanie Tellis, and I am the founder and executive director of the Anti-Bias Educator. I wanted to take this time to talk with you about teaching current events because there's so much that's going on in the world right now. There was a massive earthquake in Haiti. The United States of America has just pulled their troops out of Afghanistan. And COVID-19 is still a worldwide pandemic, especially with all the new variants that keep popping up. And the list goes on and on and on. It really is a lot. But the thing is, it's always been a lot. Every time period has its fair share of uncertainty and once-in-a-lifetime world-changing events. But it's our job as educators to equip the students in our care with the tools to understand and face these events head on. That's why it's so important that we not only make the time to address and teach current events in our classrooms, but that we also make sure that we do so in a way that is proactive, responsive, and circular. Let's talk more about that. One of the first things that usually comes up when discussing the teaching of current events is the concept of age appropriateness. My response to this is always twofold. First is this pearl of wisdom from my father, who told me that if I was old enough to ask, I was old enough to receive an answer. He and my mother fundamentally believed that knowledge was power, and if they didn't provide the answers and/or context that I was seeking, I would go elsewhere to find that information, and there would be no telling what misinformation I could possibly walk away with. It's not our job as educators to tell our students what to think and/or do about a situation, but it is our job to provide them with the information and the facts of what is happening. When we withhold information from our students because we have deemed them as unable to handle whatever it is that is happening, we've shut off a critical avenue of learning and processing to them. Trust and believe that they will still learn about the situation, whatever it is, but now it will be outside of the confines of a space that has been specifically curated to encourage critical thinking and academic rigor. Secondly, there are students who are living through the first-hand reality of the events that have occurred. If those students are old enough to live through it, then your students are old enough to learn about it. Now, of course, you need to select resources that have been chunked, modified, leveled, and/or scaled to ensure that your students will understand the content without being overwhelmed. You'll also want to ensure that you have procedures in place for students in case they still do become overwhelmed, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The point that I'm trying to make is that we ultimately do our students a disservice when we don't discuss the harsh realities of the world around us, the world that they are inheriting. When we reinforce in our students the belief that life is fair to everyone, and if you're a good person, everything will eventually work out in your favor and you'll have a really good life, what we're really doing is nurturing a harvest of bias and inequity. We as adults know that life is not fair. And while a rising tide might lift all boats, we are inhabiting very different boats. Some of us have canoes, while some of us have yachts, and yet others have luxury cruise ships. And some of us have had no say-so in the boat we ended up in. And despite our best efforts, there are systemic barriers that prevent us from moving to a different boat. By focusing solely on the rising tide and actively choosing to ignore the condition of the different boats, we teach our students that people's lived realities do not matter, and systemic barriers are of no real consequence because ultimately, we're all in this together. And while that may technically be true, there's a very real difference between the experience of a storm in a canoe versus a luxury cruise ship. Now that we understand the importance of the why we need to be teaching current events, let's shift to the how. There are 3 things you need to do when teaching current events in an anti-bias classroom. Let's be proactive, responsive, and make sure you circle back to ensure that no child is left behind. Let's take these one by one. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. While you may not know the exact situation that will occur, you can bet your last dollar that there will be a situation. That's why it's important to be proactive when teaching current events. And by that, I mean you need to start by examining your classroom culture and environment first. Teaching and learning about current events requires the ability to engage with multiple perspectives and dissenting views, as well as the ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn as events are unfolding in real time. And what might be true one day could very well no longer be true the next. If you have not fostered an environment that has students engaged in those behaviors already, it will be very hard to do that at the drop of a dime, just because a major event has occurred. These are the skills that should be interwoven throughout your class so that when complex situations arise, students are already prepared with the tools needed to engage in the difficult conversations that will follow. Next, you'll want to mind your curriculum and your calendar for opportunities to pre-schedule time to teach about current events. This can manifest itself a number of different ways. For example, when I taught an Intro to Social Studies class for sixth graders, every Friday I blocked off the first 15 to 20 minutes of class to discuss current events. It allowed me to teach the soft skills more explicitly, some of those soft skills I just mentioned, right? It allowed me to teach them with low-stake events, right? While also providing built-in time to discuss any major situations as they unfolded. My students loved it, and it was a really great way, a really great routine to end our week. Additionally, when I taught seventh grade English, I actively sought out current events that were tied directly to the novels we were reading to encourage students to make connections between the text and the real world. This allowed my students to not only develop deeper understandings of the novels, but to also see and understand some of the real life implications of the themes and issues we were encountering in our readings. And finally, you'll want to be proactive about your boundaries and limitations. While we are educators and do our best to check and root out our biases, we are nonetheless humans, and each one of us has our own limitations. I found one of mine in the spring of 2015 while teaching in Baltimore, and Freddie Gray was killed by the police. I was so angry and hurt that I couldn't bring myself to present any form, level, fashion of impartialness to the situation because it was too real and too proximate for me. My now husband had been pulled over and harassed by the Baltimore Police Department so much that we were in the process of considering filing a formal complaint. I was in absolutely no place or space to be discussing this situation with any student, period. Luckily, I had a supportive department chair who listened when I voiced my concerns and restructured things to ensure that I had the time and space I needed to go through my own process without causing harm to my students. And they were still able to learn about what was happening because my colleagues stepped up and filled in the gap. Knowing your boundaries and your limitations is important to not only protect yourself, but to protect your students as well. The second thing that you'll need is responsiveness, right? When teaching current events, flexibility is key. Things are dynamic as events unfold in real time, and if you're not responsive to the needs of your students, it's going to be all bad. So you'll want to pause when and where needed. If there's a major situation unfolding and students are preoccupied with it, very little of your pre-planned learning goals are actually going to be met. So pressing through and forcing a everything is normal approach is a waste of everyone's time. I vividly remember sitting in Mr. Miller's math class sophomore year of high school and hearing shouting and commotion in the halls and feeling confused because something was clearly wrong, but none of us knew what it was. Mr. Miller went out to investigate and came back in and immediately turned on our classroom TV where we watched the devastating events of 9/11 continue to unfold. Can you imagine if after a few minutes he turned off the TV and said, well, that's enough of that. Let's get back to math. Absolutely no math of any shape, form, and or fashion would have been learned, completed, done, anything, right? Instead, he left the TV on and to the best of his abilities answered our questions and explained to us what was taking place. This brings me to my next point. It's okay not to know. Because these situations are almost always dynamic and ever evolving, it is impossible impossible to have all the answers. I remember before the second tower was hit, a classmate asked if someone could have did this on purpose. Mr. Miller responded, probably not. There must have been some sort of malfunction or medical emergency on board, and not to worry too much about it. And then the second plane hit. And a visibly shaken Mr. Miller sat down and had to collect himself. And as he gathered himself, another classmate asked what we were all thinking. But why? Why would someone do this? And Mr. Miller gave the best answer that he could give at that time. I don't know. I don't know. Mr. Miller modeled for me that day what the grace and humility looks like to say, I don't know. And while I hope we never find ourselves in a situation of that magnitude as educators, if we do, I hope that you will have the courage to say, I don't know, because your students will respect you for it. Last but not least, you'll need to do regular temperature checks with your students to see how they're feeling and how they're processing what's happening. This will allow you to make accommodations as needed to help ensure that while the process might be challenging, it's not overwhelming and students don't shut down and disengage from the learning process. And finally, the last thing that you want to do when you're teaching current events is make sure that you don't leave any of your students behind. You've got to circle back. There's several ways to go about ensuring that students progress and don't get stuck when teaching about current events. One of the most familiar strategies is to schedule individual check-ins with students in addition to the whole group and small group temperature checks you will also be doing, the ones that I just referenced, right? If students are at the heart of your teaching, then you need to be checking in frequently and in multiple modalities to assess their progress. You'll also want to revisit the topic as often as necessary and add in any new and pertinent information as it becomes available. Current events should never be taught as a one and done happenstance, and staying up to date on the situation is a key part of how students are able to better fully understand what is happening and the why and the how. So now that we've covered why teaching current events is important and how you need to structure your classroom to teach current events, I want to share with you this list of resources that I've put together. I know how valuable time is when you're teaching, so you'll want to keep these resources on hand when you're planning in advance and also for in the moment when things happen. As always, you will still need to vet these sources for your students to ensure that they are the right materials to help your class meet their learning objectives. But isn't it nice to have a starting point? Look at all these resources. And this is to cover a wide range of grade levels. There are some early reader versions of these resources as well as some high school, college levels. So you want to go through each one and see what works best for you and your students in your classroom. As our time together comes to a close, I want to leave you with one question. What is one thing you're going to do to better prepare to teach the challenging current events that present themselves over the course of this year? Because they're going to happen. So what are you going to do? I'm really interested in your responses. Please leave your answers in the comments below. I appreciate you spending this time with me so that you can build a more anti-biased classroom in order to ensure that every student in your care is seen, heard, and affirmed. I'm rooting for you. I want to help you on your journey to becoming the anti-bias educator you know your students deserve. Do not hesitate to reach out if you find yourself stuck and or just want to talk through some of these concepts and questions. Our contact information is in the description below. Please be sure to also like and subscribe to see more anti-bias and DEI educational content. New videos are released on Thursdays. And you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter listed below for bite-sized anti-bias educational content. If you're interested in DEI, anti-bias, anti-racist instructional coaching, and or curricular service, you can complete our intake form below and we'll get back to you, all right? Until next time, good luck on your journey to becoming the anti-bias educator you know your students deserve.